Right, go.
Okay, welcome everyone to the IHR Digital History Seminar and our first seminar of the year. Just to let you know, we do have a live stream going, so appropriate decorum required. It's my pleasure to introduce Joe Gouldy, who is the Hans Rothschild Assistant Professor of Modern Britain and its Empire at Brown University. Joe's in town for many reasons. One of the reasons he's in town is promoting her book, which he wrote with David Armitage, called The History Manifesto. But she's also here tonight to talk to us a little bit about some of the work she's been doing the last couple of years, including the wonderful paper machines. So I'll hand over to Jo.
Thank you so much, James. It's such a pleasure to be here. The last time I was at the Institute for Historical Research, there was a big social history conference, and I got into a massive fight over Foucault with Patrick Joyce. And I knew at that moment that I had achieved my graduate student dreams, and I was actually a social historian. Yeah, we had members of the audience like making catcalls about Foucault. So it's wonderful to be back. I'm so delighted to be here. And I'm wondering if we can possibly go around the room, because this is a new group to me, and I don't know who you are and what sorts of institutions or courses of study or interests you represent. So I'd love name, specialty, institution, anything else you'd like to say if we could go around.
I feel I should start, because I failed to say that before. I'm James Baker, I work at the British Library, and I'm a curator of digital research there, and I'm a historian of 18th century Britain.
I'm Sarah Milligan. I'm the publishing manager for British History Online, which is based here at the IHR. I'm not a historian by nature, but I'm sort of new to to history. I have a background in English.
My name is Adam Crimble. I am a lecturer of digital history at University of Hertfordshire, and I look at 18th and 19th century migration.
I'm John Levin. I'm the PhD at Southampton on debtors and assumption seekers.
Alan Davis. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bristol, and I work on post-war British economic and political financial history.
I'm JP. I'm doing a collaborative PhD with the National Archives of the University of York, and I'm a historian turned technologist.
I'm David Phillips. I'm a library science student at City University, and so a general interest in history as well.
My name is Tessa. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UCL, and I work on a European funded digital history project, and we're looking at digitized newspaper culture, European digitized newspaper culture.
I'm Peter Francois. I'm both at the University of Hertfordshire and University of Oxford, and I work on the intersection between history, computer science, and biology.
And I'm Henry Irving. I'm a historian who's squatting in the Institute of English Studies, and I'm working on projects that connect to the Ministry of Information, which is responsible for British propaganda.
I'm Robert Tidal. I'm based at UCL, and I'm working on the same project as this.
I'm Brooke Palmieri, and I'm a PhD student at UCL in the History Department. I'm an early modernist, but toward the tail end of the early modern period, working on dissident literature and how it was circulated across the Atlantic as made possible by Quakers. So,
I'm Justin Coulson. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Exeter, working on 16th and 17th century medicine.
I'm Richard Desworth, lecturer in modern European history at University of East Anglia, one of the conveners, and interested in modern 20th century European history, and also currently working on web archives.
I'm Matt Philpott. I work for the School of Advanced Study as a manager of digital resources. I'm also background as an early modern historian.
I'm Christopher Brewster. I'm a senior lecturer in information technology at Aston Business School, and I'm a failed historian.
Wonderful. So we've just gone around and said name, institution, field, just because I'm new here.
My name is Alex Klein. I'm a PhD researcher at Anglia Ruskin in Cambridge, and I work on archives and technology.
Great. So a very, very diverse group, both methodologically and and temporally we're scattered over early modern to modern periods, and we've come from all over. And actually, I'm delighted to see that I have all sorts of old friends who I previously have known only on Twitter in this room. It's great to actually figure out what you guys look like when you're face to face. Hey, it's a community. So I want to give a little bit of a talk as an introduction before we merge into a discussion. And I want to give a talk that foregrounds the piece of technology that I've been working on and the long-term questions that I'm interested in, which are things like the way historians think over the 20th century versus the way economists think over the 20th century. I want to foreground that question in light of three stories that converge around the History Manifesto, this new book that came out on Friday, and which David Armitage and I are in London to talk about this week. So the first is a story about self-examination, the role of self-examination in history, the role of self-examination in the digital humanities, and how those two converge. And I'll be giving you a little bit of the reasons that we felt inclined to write a History Manifesto, which largely predicts the coming centrality of digital history and the digital humanities more generally, not only to the future of the university, but also to the future of humanity at large. Second, I want to talk about a threefold convergence, a convergence that this will shift from retrospective analysis to analysis and prophecy, a threefold convergence that we think is going on in terms of publishing, project making, and tools, specifically in the digital humanities, how those things looked different 5 years ago and where we think they're going, as largely as a result of these contextual situations, the need of universities to justify themselves, the need for a moment of self-examination. Why are we building these new tools? What sort of tools are we building? And then third, I'd like to talk about the technology that I spend the most time on, paper machines. And I want to offer it to you as a provocation, as an experiment in addressing the larger ecosystem of information in the academy. Not as a tool that I think everyone will use. It's not a tool that's suited to many language groups. It's not a tool that's particularly suited to early modernists. In many senses, it's a wonky tool that sometimes crashes. Hi, Vinay. But I want to foreground it as a tool that is built to work within existing platforms that answers some of the metaphysical and ecosystematic problems that digital humanities and the humanities more largely are facing at this moment, and a paradigmatic tool for hypothesis generation on the long term. So let me start at the top of that with self-examination. Self-examination in history and history's role in the public, and what does this have to do with the digital humanities? So in the manifesto that we published on Friday, the History Manifesto, historymanifesto.cambridge.org. It's also a physical book. It's so new that I don't even have my own copy. I get one tomorrow. But you can now download the entire PDF, open access, thanks to the Cambridge site. So we wrote this manifesto based on the idea that we need a thorough self-examination of how research and scholarship are changing in light of new tools. What is the digital humanities doing to the types of questions that we can answer in history? And this came to both of us in a long conversation about what we were doing in each of our departments, where our non-digital historian colleagues, our regular historians, our regular literature professor friends were coming to us and saying, show us the pinnacle. Show us the evidence that the digital humanities, that the new computational sciences are transforming the field, that there's something that we can't do without. Do my graduate students absolutely need to know this? Do my undergraduates need to know this? Is information changing the way that everyone works? Obviously, information is changing the way that everyone works. Have you read the newspaper recently? Have you heard of the place Shirky? Obviously. What's the problem? What's the problem? Well, the problem was insufficient, masterful monographs that point out a new methodological direction, grounded in things that we can do with computers that we couldn't do previously. We make maps. We made maps as historians. We analyzed keywords, but we analyzed keywords when we had Raymond Williams around. You just need a 70-year-old who's read every Victorian novel that's ever been published. No problem. You don't need a computer for that. We did lots of things. So it seemed to us that we needed a serious period of self-examination about history and the new technologies. And not only history, but history and the public. History's position in the public. Because new forms of publication, if we're making lots of maps, part of the question about why we would be making lots of maps or doing lots of keyword analysis depends on for whom. It depends on that public and that potential public of policymakers and bureaucrats and members of the public, and people in a democracy who might need those historical maps. What do you need the history for? So we foregrounded the question of audience. And this is important because if you look backwards, it's been a moment. It's been a minute since a historian has asked as a historian, where are we right now in space and time? Where are we right now in space and time? And where's our audience right now? The relevant piece of historiography that keeps on coming up in these conversations is Newstat in May, a book from the 1980s about how policymakers employ history, whether reluctantly, whether they're conscious of it or not. They are always analogizing. You have only to look at the case of every war. Is Iraq more like Vietnam? Is it more like the Second World War? Historical thinking always involves choices in policy. But for thorough self-investigation, what could history be used for? What should it be used for? Who is our perfect audience? You need to look back even earlier. It's been even longer since we've had that discussion as a discipline, as a profession. We have to look backward to Michel Desserteau, to Herbert Butterfield, to E.H. Carr for a conversation about who owns history, about history, what history looks like in the hands of peasants, what history looks like in the hands of rulers, about how history is transformed when it's written for different audiences. An interrogation into the purposes for which we do history. And thirdly, on this point, significantly, the theory of the digital humanities, the innumerable scholars who have been coming together in that camps, in new burgeoning digital humanities centers and new centers and libraries across the world, digitizing previously unlooked at archives of scale, has rarely gone near these questions. And this is interesting to me because they've gone near every other question. They have theorized every other part of the practice of being. From 2012 to 2014, innumerable stacks of edited volumes on theory, deconstructing what it means to be an author in the age of the digitized text after the hyperlink, what it means to be a reader, what we do in classrooms, what happens to hierarchy in classrooms, what the future of the university is. We've written about all of these things, but we haven't yet approached the question of what DH does for the public. So we wanted to bring that question up to date. We haven't really looked into the question of the public future of DH, its responsibilities, how it might change the university. And then the ultimate question, the very conservative question about how new technologies shape new disciplines, a question which the Mellon has been funding heavily, the subject of a conference at the University of Chicago in May. How do new technologies shape the disciplines? Sociology had a theory of agency. It had a theory of how actors change society before Gephi came along, but now everyone does Gephi. We all do social networking technology. We all have maps of the social network. And so thinking about the network and the network's influence, how the network is an actor in sociology has changed. The kinds of research questions change with the technology. Sociologists did oral interviews before the era of the cell phone, but now everybody has a recording device in their purse. So the way that in which we conduct interviews and the scale of the interviews and what we can do with that when it's transmuted from speech to text, and you have a large number of texts and interviews in sociology, that changes the questions, how many questions you can ask. And so similarly in history, we have archives of an unprecedented scale. Often we work on one archive at a time. What do these archives of unprecedented scale, these large numbers of texts and words hanging out together, what does that do to our question? So what's not new in this conversation is the digital humanities. We did not invent the digital humanities. David Armitage and I will not claim anywhere to have invented the digital humanities or the theories that have gone before us. We did not invent most of the technologies we are talking about. Similarly, we did not invent the turn to the long term, a turn from micro timescales to macro timescales, doing history on longer and longer scales, which is what we diagnose in the History Manifesto as something that's already underway in the form of big history, deep history, the writings of David Christen, of Dan Smale, world history and interest in larger and larger categories of what we can look at. This is something that's already been going on, and it represents, we think, a turn in pedagogy, a turn in how we talk to undergraduates, how we talk to graduate students, what we find permissible in a journal article, what we find interesting in a dissertation from the work that was going on when many of us trained in the 1980s and 1990s. So a shift in timescale is underway. We didn't invent it, we're merely diagnosing it. But from this interest in what's happening in the digital humanities, how the digital humanities intersect with these other ways in which history is changing, to talk to larger and larger audiences about larger and larger problems, some of them driven by environmental catastrophism, right? Belief that an environmental apocalypse is near, and we need deep history in order to understand our place in the ecosystem and our responsibilities to it. Thinking about working closer with other scientific disciplines in order to understand that. Working with policy on a global scale, working in a world in which transnational economies are the rule of the day, and we need transnational comparisons to understand that. All of that has come here. And what does that mean for the digital humanities? So I want to spell out for you that we think that we are on the cusp of a threefold convergence, a convergence in publishing projects and tools. That many of the ideas that were spelled out in that huge body of theory that the digital humanities produced at those that camps 5 years ago, pie in the sky ideas about how we were going to break down peer review, how we were going to reconfigure the classroom, how we were going to reconfigure the project, that those theories are now ripe. And they are ripe for the first time. We think that this is an event. We think it's a moment. We think things are changing right now. So let me give you the evidence that I've got for that. Things are changing right now. We are ready for new models in publishing. The History Manifesto is an open access publication. It's released in Creative Commons. You can remix it. You can prescribe it to your seminar, and you can teach it the same way that you would teach a seminar if you were examining a text line by line with a series of advanced graduate students. We have the technology to comment line by line in the margins. Now, this is unprecedented, even for digital humanities work. Got an email a couple of weeks ago from Dan Cohen, who said, "How did you do it? This is crazy." And Roy Rosenzweig and I wrote the last textbook on the digital humanities. We approached every press that we could think of, and Roy Rosenzweig was a well-connected man. We asked them all, can we go out open access? Open access is the future. Everybody in Silicon Valley knows this. Information wants to be free. What's the big deal? What's the problem? Academic presses, are you ready? And the academic presses said, no. They said no to Dan Cohen and Roy Rosenzweig. We approached 4 different presses for the History Manifesto and asked them to go open access. We didn't expect that they would. Academic publishing lags behind other forms of publishing. The newspapers and mainstream consumer publishing are ahead of them. So we approached 4 presses, and to our shock, all 4 of them said that they would give us open access. All 4 of them were willing to do it. We went with Cambridge because Cambridge was willing to do the most sophisticated platform for user text interaction. They were willing to design this custom website where you could comment in the margin and have a conversation that would lead into a forum, and they were willing to supply staff for the background of a digital publishing mechanism. And they didn't come up with this idea, we didn't come up with this idea. It was theorized 5 years ago, but institutionally we're on the cusp of something cracking open. Second, I think we're at a moment when we are ready for new projects. There were new projects that embrace this turn from micro timescales to macro timescales. In the History Manifesto, we lay out a fundamental problem of scale, that scale is the specific advantage of going digital humanities. Why do you go with computers when you used to go with close reading? The computer, and as Matthew Joggers, it's Franco Moretti, theorized years ago now, the specific advantage of DH is that it is one of scales. The computer won't grow tired reading 5 million books. You and I will grow tired. We will have to take shortcuts. The computer will take shortcuts and use its algorithms, but it'll take shortcuts in specific directions. Specific advantage of DH is scale. One of the scales that we have to work with in terms of history is time, maybe the fundamental scale. How can we gain confidence in our propositions when we say that there was a turning point, when we say that there was an event, when we say that we are living in the moment of an information revolution? What do we mean by that? What sorts of evidence can we marshal to support that? So we're interested in the fact that we seem to be on a cusp of new models of time, where the work of people like Brad Pasanek and Peter Bohl, working on a larger and larger scale, seems to mean that digital humanities is moving from the old questions that we inherited from micro timescales, like, can a computer read Gertrude Stein? Can a computer read a sonnet by William Shakespeare? And it's turning from that to, what can digitized maps tell us about 5,000 years of Chinese history? What can they tell us about 5,000 novels from the 19th century? What computers do that's different? It's shifting disciplinary questions about what it means to be a historian. And it's shifting them from the micro to the macro in this direction that was already called for in terms of policy by environmental historians, world historians, deep historians, separately from what the digital humanities was doing. The third aspect of this threefold convergence is that we are ready for new kinds of tools. New kinds of tools. So here as well, there were pioneers beforehand that seemed to signal a new attitude in tool making, from adopting the possibilities of what we could do with algorithms to read Shakespearean sonnets and look towards massive scale, towards public collective archives, accessible interfaces. We could look at Ingram as one of the chief most pioneers. But we see diagnosed in the History Manifesto a turn towards tool building in the form of initiatives like Matt Connolly's declassification engine or Zachary Karabel's alternative financial metrics. Now, what we're talking about here is a new kind of tool, one that works with existing mass digitized information that archivists have already put into public circulation and asks, what is the highest public good? Who in the public would this serve if we read it the right way? So Matthew Connolly's declassification engine, for example, gives you a portrait of the dark archives by showing you what the United States has left declassified, what files cannot be circulated under the Freedom of Information Act. And this is of interest not only to historians for speculative reasons, because we're interested in the history of state and we're interested in democracy and the freedom of the press. It's also massively of interest to individuals whose FOIA records have disappeared, who are interested in particular political initiatives, whose FOIA records have disappeared. And Connolly is able to demonstrate as a historian that the numbers of the percentage of documents in the bureaucracy that the United States is creating that are declassified, that are not free to circulate, has been mounting and mounting generation and generation rampantly from the 1980s through the last decade. That we are leaving larger proportions of our government dark and invisible than at any point in the past. So this is history in the service of an immediate public event. It's also the use of a massive data archive about the government, both the things that they've released and the things they haven't released. Incidentally, it's also a use of crowdsourcing to request the FOIA documents and then report the ones that were denied. Zachary Karabel's alternative financial metrics is another example. Zachary Karabel is a historian of financial metrics who tells us that the indicators that economists routinely and naively use, like employment, like GDP, like GNP, are themselves freighted with the politics of the 1930s. They're freighted with conditions of not measuring women's labor, of not measuring the labor even of farmers. A farmer is unemployed, let alone nationalism, let alone what else they spell for the global economy. So as we insist on measuring things like presidential performance in terms of GDP and GNP, we revert to essentially 1950s values encoded in the discipline of economics. So Karabel is trained as a historian, as a graduate of the Harvard PhD program. And he's taken his reading of large archives and large metrics, large quantifiable archives, into a creation of a set of alternative financial indicators, alternative financial measurements. He sells them. He no longer works as a historian. He's selling alternative metrics to investors who are dissatisfied with what they're getting from economics departments, because it turns out that time is a very valuable indicator to be able to work with. So new models of tool building, where the tool are happening. We believe that real world applications for a public audience about explicitly political material in the data are at the heart of where the digital humanities are moving. We believe that the tool is becoming reimagined as a collective disruption. We believe that the tool is becoming a public service, applicable to as much data as possible, helping the people to defeat a crisis of too much paper to read, the crisis of modern bureaucracy. This is a historical situation about the way our archives have developed, and we need new tool building to help the public navigate through a bureaucracy characterized by too much paper to read. So I want to move on from those two diagnoses, one retrospective and one prospective. The conversations that we've had around this as we've gone around talking about the History Manifesto have centered around what changes these new digital technologies imply for research and teaching. So we stress the shift from the micro to the macro. We stress a shift from the private humanities to the public future. We shift new directions. Publishing is becoming public-facing and politically engaged, highly visual, open access, built on an open reconfigurable data. And we stress new directions in tool building. No more one-off tools for couture archives. I'm building this just for my one research project, funded for a researcher and a host of research assistants. These new tools, this new generation of tools, holds up a higher paradigm for collaboration. It holds up a higher paradigm for what the digital history researcher could do or should do in light of the public, and the responsibilities that funders, institutions, and archives should set out for the types of proposals that we accept. What do we want to see when we see a proposal for digital research? Do we just want to see a recapitulation of art for art's sake? What can the computer tell us about poetry, the nature of poetry? We think that a broader set of fundamental political, economic issues are at stake. So in that light, I want to shift from this retrospective perspective analysis to paper machines as an example. So I want to introduce paper machines, the technology that I spend most of my time working with, a technology that we invented, a toolkit for historians, that we worked around the question, what happens if we go macro? What happens if we collaborate, imagining big data for public political purposes? What happens if the purpose of the digital humanities is not to prove that I am a digital humanities researcher, but rather to launch 1,000 Picketies, 1,000 big data interventions in the way political economic discussions are had in the ecosystem around history as a discipline at large. So let me just introduce paper machines for a second. When I was working on my dissertation, when I was hanging out at places like the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven, where this shot was taken, I spent a lot of time around archives that look like this. And we thought a lot about the material nature of the archive. So this is a book of maps, and the pencil is part of what I'm documenting. The pencil is there to indicate that it's important that the book is a certain size. The book is a pocket book of maps. It's of a generation when map makers are making books of maps of a size that can be carried because of the interventions in the British road system. Because a new system of roads has made travel into a new art. So rather than having a table-sized book of maps, I have a pocket-sized book of maps. They're readily reprinted through the new printing technology. So we understand all of this. When we look at this book of maps, the maps themselves may be less interesting than this book. The archives that I work on now tend to look more like this. These are various storerooms and broom closets in various parts of the United Nations and affiliated other offices. Some of them are at think tanks at the University of Wisconsin. I've also been hanging out around activist broom closets and filing cabinets. Some of them are digitals. There are some massive computers there. This is the welcome to the 20th century. Welcome to the 18th century trained historian of political economy, trying to wrestle with what an archive looks like in the 20th century. An archive in the 20th century looks materially very different. It's the age not only of new publishing technologies, but new filing and photocopying technologies, where you can take a handwritten or typed memo and then instantly Xerox or photocopy and make hundreds of other copies that go around to other branch offices and then are refiled into new matrices of information. These filing cabinets diagnose land reform movements all over the world from the 1940s through the 1970s. That's their purpose. They're supposed to train a new generation of experts in sociology, economy, and agrarian economy to go around and help peasant land movements all over the world. So if I need to understand the archive, it's not good enough for me as somebody who is interested in the material nature of the archive to do what many political historians have done for years upon years, the venerated art of going after a single biography, going over after an institutional biography, doing the biography of a particular event, the protests around 1968. It's not enough to just tell those stories, because as an 18th centuryist, I'm so impressed by the nature of the archive. What does it mean that states are producing paper at this level? When I wrote about the infrastructure state in the 18th century, I was already impressed by the way in which the road lobby was using piles of paper as a wall, as a barricade, to stop the Tory opposition from getting their way in Parliament. The amount of paper published by any other lobby up to 1785, when the road lobby gets off the ground, takes up about this much space every year in the annals of Parliament. After the road lobby, every year takes up about this much space. Produce too much paper to read, the opposition can't read the articles that you're producing. You bulldoze the opposition in terms of articles. And so I started to get very interested in what was happening in economics and agrarian economy in these kinds of archives. What's happening when Marxists and libertarians are duking it out in the 1970s in agrarian economics journals, journals of peasant studies, journals of development studies, journals of economics. And how would I measure that? How can I step back and tell you about the nature of the archive? I'm less interested in any individual economist. Milton Friedman's role in the land reform movement, not that crucial, kind of interesting. Some of his ideas show up in different places, but the nature of the archive, the fact that these disciplines are going head to head over world events, that's part of the world that we're living. Telling the story of how that came to be and what the archive looks like is very much telling the story of how our world came to be and the role that various experts play in making policy today. So how, as a digital humanist, as somebody interested in big data, can I implement this? And this seemed to me to be exactly the kind of project that I was looking at. On all of these THAT conferences, in which we talked about the nature of archives, is a computer better suited to reading a million novels or a few lines of poetry? Scale kept on coming up. And here we had it. Unlimited scale, easily OCRable, generated by institutions that already had TypeScript and print, easily digitizable. The World Bank was already digitizing all of its official reports. How could you step back and read that as a whole? So I was also interested in an easily manipulable, easily digestible tool, a tool that I could convince other historians to take on and experiment with, a tool that I could teach in my graduate seminars, because it struck me that I was going to create a tool for a very large question. What did modern economics do to the world system around 1968? And this isn't a question that I expect to answer on my own. I'm going to answer some very specific things about what economics did to the land reform question. But it would be greatly to my advantage if all of you decided that this was a wildly interesting topic, and that the archives were already out there, and that my tool was interesting. And then you joined me in refining it and debating with me the specific uses of this tool in this question. That would be wonderful. So it was very important to me that the tool be built on existing platforms, that the tool be interchangeable, that I not use whatever grant money I did just to create the perfect illustration for my argument, but I created a platform for other people to work with the data with me. So exactly these same things that I've seen people like Matt Connolly do, an interchangeable archive for the public that gets other people interested in the same problem. So these were the instructions. The instructions are very straightforward. Zotero already existed. And Zotero was already built around many of these aims. So here's Zotero. If you haven't seen it before, hopefully everybody in the digital humanities has. I resisted it for a long time, and then I fell prey to its seductions, because it is really wonderful, because Roy Rosenzweig and Dan Cohen and their friends designed it with historians being chummy in mind. What they understood when they built this platform was that we historians already like working with each other's archives. We already like building and remixing new trains of thought from what other people have done before. I take your footnotes and then I remix them with some more recent scholarship, and hey presto, I've got a disciplinary revolution. I take your reading list from Qualls, I add to it more recent literature, and I've got my literature for Qualls. So that's why Zotero works the way it does. You've got your library of all of the things you're reading, and then it's built to share libraries with other digital historians. So we had a toolkit, we had a platform that was already built for historians adding to each other's archives, hand curating large-scale archives, all of the text on landform, all of the text on economy. And people like David Armitage and myself were already using this as a tool for graduate training, for getting graduate students thinking about what happens if I use my graduate seminar as a way of building upon other graduates' lists of reading materials to build up their qualms. What if I take that as the basis of my dissertation and build up the secondary literature? So we knew that this would be fruitful, that it would mesh well with the iterative ways in which historians already work. Iterative building up and analyzing of a corpus. And we wanted to design a tool that would be useful for hypothesis generation. So we started looking around at what the state of the art was in computer science departments, what computer scientists had already built in terms of visualizing and analyzing large-scale textual corpora. And this is the new paper machines database. This is what happens. We already have Zotero, and then when you install paper machines, this menu pops up and you get a nice little word cloud. And the word cloud is there to tell you what is in that folder. So if you just want a metric, what sorts of things is my colleague reading about? It's not, this isn't, I'm never going to publish these word clouds, but if we're in a graduate seminar and we've all made a reading list on the history of economics as a discipline, I'm going to look around and yours is going to have bunnies and yours is going to have bombs, and I'm going to say, oh, they've got different viewpoints on the history of economics as a discipline. Great, okay. So we wanted hypothesis generation. So among the things that happens is that it's a geoparsed heat map of different place names mentioned in the text. This is from an article that I'm working on the history of participatory mapping. The participatory mapping movement is extremely important to some of our colleagues in nearby disciplines. 200 villagers make a map together, and so you overturn some of the history of the rule of experts a la Tim Mitchell. You don't need a surveyor, you don't need a state to establish property rights, you have a lightweight, flexible thing. So where did that movement take off, and where is it being used? Where is it being used? Well, I could read 500 articles, or I could take those 500 articles and plop them into my geoparser, and out comes a heat map. So I don't know if I'm going to publish this. I don't know how good the OCR is, but it's a hypothesis generation machine. You've got some blue on a lot of place names, and those seem to be the place names that come up the most frequently. There's another experiment in geoparsing novels and memoirs about tramping in the age of Jack London. There's a part of the Popular Front, it's all about migration. So if you're interested in all of the places that are mentioned in this worldwide network of hobos, the hobos go all over the world, or at least they're thinking about places all over the world. So what happens if you scale back? We use topic modeling to generate hypotheses. This is a hand-created corpus of essays about land reform between 1880 and 2000. What are the ideas that come up in different generations? When does the land reform movement get started? We said 1890 on the basis of this visualization. It's turned out to be more or less accurate. We've added a lot more text since then. But where this becomes truly useful is the historian who is face to face with that immense trove of filing cabinets, those deadly filing cabinets. So what this is a visualization of is 7 different branches at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, seven different branches who are working between 1946 and 1990. So as a historian, I have the choice. I can decide to go in depth about any one of these offices. And in the past, I would probably read some secondary sources and make an informed decision. But there aren't that many secondary sources about the Food and Agriculture Organization. There just aren't. It's a really important body of international government, and there's not that much written yet. It's been hiding out in the shadows. So I had a lot of photographs, so I scanned a lot of stuff. And what this is supposed to be telling you is that I was interested in 2 topics in particular. One topic is about economics. It's about debt. It's about budget, and debt, and the cost of things and programs. This is the economist's topic model. This is another topic model, which is about peasants and cooperatives. Loosely, these are the economists and these are the historians. This is the right wing and this is the left wing. So what this is telling me is that if I want to choose two offices to go in detail and read thoroughly, where I'm going to read every document and then tell you what's going on at these offices, I'm not going to read everything that the file did. I'm going to read that office and that office, the ones that are most heavily structured in one direction or another. I'm going to think about who's in each of those offices. So I can do a sort of metric and make an informed reading decision about where I read more narrowly. So we have flight paths. So what is it good for? It's good for a macroscope on long-term change. So we were disaggregating the data from the tools so that many people could work on these things together. Many people could come up with theories. Many people could compare these theories. They could compare different parts of the corpus. I can have an undergraduate seminar or a graduate seminar working on the same research questions that I am and turning up extremely fruitful things that could be material for their own dissertation. Can share this with the public and have another involved conversation about the history of these institutions. Disaggregating data from tools, making a tool which is universally useful for other people who are dealing with bureaucracies and the official mind, who can plug in and share their data on the back of Zotero, a platform that already exists for sharing and comparing and iteratively enhancing our hand-curated archives. And this is a tool for that is inherently useful for hypothesis generation on the long scale, for big scale questions. Those topic models that I showed you, the timelines, are useful from getting a suggestion about when in time I might want to read more. If I've got a whole lot of different offices, which office in particular might I want to read about? This is a way of hacking into those questions, going from the macro question to the micro, and doing macro storytelling over the long durée about big data with the computer giving me confidence that I'm studying the right place, I'm studying the right institution, I'm studying the right year, I'm studying the right branch of the office. So this is something that we have never had before in macro timescales. Macro DH can do things that deep history, world history have never been able to do on their own. They build iteratively on other people's narratives. They don't have quantitative confidence behind them. This is something that we can add. So let me just give you a hint about where this is going. Hypothesis generation is more crucial to me for launching 1,000 Picaddies, 1,000 informed public critiques, 1,000 imaginations, 1,000 informed, confident decisions about what to study over the long durée. Hypothesis generation is more important than proof in visual form. I'm not interested in error bars. I'm less interested in error bars than I am in provocative visualizations that suggest what I might want to read. So I'm showing you one of these. And this is going to be my invitation to a discussion. So I'm going to show you two nasty, hairy topic models that I cannot interpret. And I want you to treat them like a Rorschach test. So here's my invitation to you. And I know we've got the Twitter sphere going, so you too, Twitterverse. Here's the Rorschach test. This is the discipline of history in the 20th century, courtesy of JSTOR Data for Research. JSTOR Data for Research spent a long time thinking about it and handed us a huge Excel sheet of all of the words in history journals, the word pairs, the words that go together, words in sequence over the 20th century in all history journals. And this is what it looks like. And these are the 20 most significant topics in terms of ones that have massive change over time, ones that go away, ones that come back, ones that are numerically significant. And so you see, if you look carefully, you'll start to see some things like women. Women weren't that important before about 1970. And then, as you all know, there was a revolution. So they have a topic in here somewhere. And then there's another topic that is something about a young man and a story and a narrative, and that goes away. So I'm looking at other topics and I see law, court, legal, I see policies, research, resource planning, and of course I'm showing you the static. I'm seeing labor history, I'm seeing histories of banking and credit, histories of model testing tests, that's the one. Model testing tests, not really here, this is where history gets physics into, right? Okay, so a little bit of a Rorschach test. And you can see how different, pay attention, keep this visualization in mind. Keep the shapes of these cones and these waves and these geological layers in mind as I show you the next visualization. And of course, this is a static graph. If you were working with this in paper machines, you'd be able to pull up the full list of topics that composed every one of those topics. Usually 5 to 10 words that the computer thinks are showing up with regularity on the same page that are frequently mentioned together. So like women, domesticity, girls, for example, would be a topic that shows you that people are thinking about gender. All right, this is the discipline of economics over the 20th century. And again, oh my God, I got it backwards. I'm so sorry. This is economics. That's why I couldn't find the women. And this is why that physics in B is such a big deal. So there's physics in B. Sorry.
What's the green wedge? Close to the bottom?
On the right?
That.
Yeah.
Let's make an educated guess. It is either equilibrium and proof or variable table variable. And there are two green wedges that expand at about the same time. All right, now this is history. There we go. That makes more sense. Okay, there's young man's story, which disappears in orange, burnt orange, getting narrower and narrower. We're still interested in young men and their stories, but we added in some other things. We added in Indians, Texas and Indians. And some of these stay fairly constant. We added in Black, Southern, and South. All right. So you can get interested in the particular topics insofar as you're able to read them, insofar as you can do anything with this Rorschach test. And you can also compare these two charts in terms of the shape of the layers and what that tells you about disciplinary revolutions. So once more, history and econ. Econ and history. And econ.
You're hypnotizing.
It's true. It's true. Everything is in the 20th century. It's about the war between economists and historians. Now you know. Yeah, so this is my provocation. What do you say? Yeah.
History changes more slowly.
A more conservative discipline. Or we could say it in a different way, less obsessed with disciplinary revolutions, with adopting the new methodology. And you can think about that in terms of the changing place, the changing hierarchy of disciplines. And we argue in the History Manifesto that we used to live in a world until about 1968 where historians were the chief advisors of policy. Historians were displaced by economists starting in about 1968. So that begs the question, what's happening in econ around 1968? And there's a lot of forking. There's a lot of forking of new models.